The Catholic Mass is a continuation of this deep biblical instinct that we need liturgy, ritual, to keep ourselves online. My fear is we're going to fall back into this kind of easy, moralism. No. The moral law is indispensable. A spirituality of trust, indispensable. But the second half of Exodus, liturgy, sacrifice, priesthood, prayer, all of that is also essential. Well, recently, in connection with an academic project I'm working on, I've been reading a lot of the book of Exodus and commentaries thereupon. Exodus, I think you could say, is the story of how God is shaping Israel as his special people. I've said many times before, God chooses Israel not for its own sake, but for the sake of the world, that through Israel the world might be drawn to God. And I think the formation takes place in three basic stages in Exodus. The first one I call spiritual, second one moral, the third one liturgical. The spiritual formation takes place through the Exodus process. So the Lord delivers them from bondage in Egypt. They're slaves, they're powerless, they can't do it on their own. But by trusting in the Lord, they come to freedom. There's the basic spiritual formation, if you want, of Israel, to learn how to trust in the power and action of God. The second type of formation is probably the one that we're most familiar with in the book of Exodus, namely moral formation. So think of the great law that comes on Mount Sinai, summed up in the Ten Commandments. God indeed tells Israel, here's how I want you to behave. But then there's a third level. I'd call it liturgical, and I'll say more about it as I go, but from chapters 25 through 40, and the book ends in chapter 40, we have almost a complete devotion to the liturgical and ritual formation of the people Israel. Now, here's what I think is kind of interesting. Most of us are rather Kantian when it comes to religion. And again, I've talked about this before. Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century philosopher, said religion basically comes down to ethics. So he thought everything in religion is meant to make us good and decent and ethically wholesome people. Our version of it, and you'll hear this a lot on the lips of people today, is, it doesn't really matter what you believe or how you worship, as long as you're a good and decent person, that's all that matters. Well, that's Kantianism. Now look, is the Bible interested in our moral formation? Yes, and Exodus is massively interested in it. Because if you want to be like the God of Israel, who is love and who is justice, well then you've got to become conformed to love and justice. Hence the very stringent moral formation. So far so Kantian. But see, what again is really interesting, that whole almost second half of the book of Exodus is devoted not to moral formation, but to liturgical and ritual formation. Can I give you just a couple of examples? But it covers almost that entire section of the book. But listen now, as they're describing how the Ark of the Covenant should be constructed. They shall make an ark of acacia wood. It shall be 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, 1.5 cubits high. You shall overlay it with pure gold. Inside and outside you shall overlay it. And mind you, this goes on for pages and pages. Here's a second one now about the ornament on top of the ark. You shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Make 1 cherub at one end, 1 cherub at the other. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat. And again, pages and pages of these descriptions. Fine descriptions of the furnishings within the tabernacle around the Ark of the Covenant. We're talking about a lampstand, a table for the so-called bread of presence, etc., etc. And then a lengthy section, so any priest is interested in this, description of the priesthood, what priests are to wear, what priests are to do, and so on. Here's a sampling. These are the vestments they shall make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a checkered tunic, a turban, and a sash. When they make these sacred vestments, they shall use gold, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and fine linen. Again, pages and pages of this fine description. Now, here's the interesting thing. There's no indication given in the book of Exodus that somehow these liturgical and sort of sacrificial and ritual prescriptions are somehow less important than the moral law. So we've heard the Ten Commandments, we've heard all of the moral requirements, and then we move right into these prescriptions. And in fact, if I might press it, turn from Exodus, you come immediately to the book of Leviticus, where you have 28 chapters dedicated to temple, priesthood, ritual, sacrifice, clean and unclean. I mean, if anything, the biblical author seems more interested in the sort of ritual, liturgical side than the moral side. Okay, so what do we post-Kantians make of this? We who tend to think, well, religion's all about morality. Here's a first observation. God does not need any of this. So please don't fall into the trap of thinking that God has got some sort of psychological hang-up. God so needs to be praised and requires this kind of fussy devotion because of his personality problems. No. God has no needs. The God who made the whole universe from nothing can't possibly benefit from anything in the universe. It's not as though God is requiring all of this. If you doubt me, by the way, take a look at chapter 1 of the book of the prophet Isaiah and look at Psalm 50 sometime. Both give you a very clear sense of how God does not need any of the sacrifice and ritual and so on. But here's the point. We need it. What is all of this doing? And I mean everything from how the priest dresses to how he gestures, how he moves, what he does, sacrifices, what the Ark of the Covenant looks like. What does all of this do? It aligns Israel unto God. Sin basically comes down to a false form of worship. I make something other than God into the supreme value. All of these ritual and liturgical gestures and vesture are meant to align Israel unto God. If the moral law brings the will into line with God's will, all this liturgical law is meant to bring our minds and hearts and imaginations on line with the divine splendor. And see, all of that is of basic importance to the right ordering of the people Israel. Okay, now you're wondering, why is this bishop telling me all this? Well, because I think it does have a special relevance to our moment in relation to COVID. Now, here's what I mean. For good reasons, now mind you, I'm not questioning this for a minute. For good reasons, we've had to, close the churches, and now people are allowed back, but in restricted ways. But there's been a distanciation of a lot of people from the formal worship of the church, from the Mass, from the Eucharist. Again, understandable. But here's my concern. The Catholics might revert to this kind of default Kantian position. What I mean is, hey, look, I've got a basically good relationship with God. I'm a decent person. I've been away from ritual and Mass and sacrifice and liturgy for all these months. Who cares? Why does it matter? If I'm a decent person, a spiritually alert person, why does it matter? Well, read the second half of the book of Exodus. Mind you, too, I speak now as a Catholic, and maybe especially to Catholics. Altar, sacrifice, temple, vestment, priesthood, incense. Well, all that you find in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, you find in the Catholic Mass. That's a hyper-biblical grounding. And not just Old Testament. Go to the book of Revelation. What do you find? As the seer looks into the heavenly court, this great liturgy going on, which involves priests and vestments and altar and sacrifice and incense and candles, etc. So the Catholic Mass is a continuation of this deep biblical instinct that we need liturgy, ritual, to keep ourselves on line. My fear is we're going to fall back into this kind of easy, moralism. No. The moral law is indispensable. a spirituality of trust, indispensable. But the second half of Exodus, liturgy, sacrifice, priesthood, prayer, all of that is also essential. So, isn't being a good person enough? Short answer, no. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.
So tonight I'm here to talk about some strategies for arguing well in good faith with atheists. Though I'll admit, I think the strategies work pretty well for arguing with just about anyone, so you can take them out for a spin. And most people who are going to give you advice about arguments are going to give you advice about how to win an argument, how to construct an argument so that there's no way out for your opponent, how to back them into a corner and get them finally, eventually, to concede. My advice tonight is not going to be primarily about how to win an argument, but how to be prepared to lose an argument. And the reason is, when two people come into conflict, the only thing that's guaranteed is at least one of them needs to lose. But the fact that I disagree with someone else isn't a guarantee that I'm right just because I'm pretty sure they're wrong. So the only thing I know for sure once a disagreement starts, even if I'm very confident that I'm the one in the right, is that at the end of this, at least one of us needs to lose. And sometimes it does have to be me. I'm extremely fortunate that my friends helped me to learn how to lose an argument gracefully when I was in college and gave me the chance to listen to the prompting of the Holy Spirit and become Catholic. But without a tutoring in how to lose an argument, I don't know that I would have gotten there. And the moment you kind of launch yourself into a disagreement, you are your opponent's teacher in how to be prepared to lose. Or really, as Christians, how to be prepared to be docile to the truth. Because all of us have had moments of needing correction and needing to submit to that correction gratefully. And in an argument, what I want to do is give my opponent the chance to embrace that. You know, I really saw this modeled for me very strongly when I went to Yale University as an undergrad and joined a debating circle. And I joined specifically the one that had the weirdest, smartest, wrong people that I could find. Because if I were going to argue with people who were right, we'd all just sit around, congratulating each other. And I wanted to talk to people who were really smart, like seemed really respectable, and yet were Christian, which I found very confusing. So I thought helpfully I would go and explain to them why they shouldn't do that anymore. And then we could just continue being really smart, really interesting, really weird atheists. And instead, much to my surprise, here I am. And part of how that happened is that my debating group, wasn't exactly like, the debating groups you may have been in a competitive debate circuit where you take sides at random, argue in front of judges, score points, and it's really an exercise in rhetoric. How well can you construct an argument so that a judge can recognize that you've put one forward and your opponent didn't answer it? But we only debated things we thought were actually true. You stuck to the side you believed in. Because after all, it was kind of dangerous to stand there arguing for things you thought were false. What if you were really good at arguing them, and then people believed them, and then lived their lives that way? So that was always the stakes. There were no judges, no prizes. Like, the stakes were the rest of the lives of everyone in the room, and it was always an open question. After tonight, how will you live your life differently? And the other thing that was great is that people really modeled that the expectation in this room was that, if you were smart, interesting, brought in good ideas to the table, at some point during your undergraduate career, you would change someone's mind. You would alter the course of their whole life. But the assumption was also probably that you would at some point find something that you, when entering college as an 18-year-old, were wrong about and would make that concession and change your life accordingly. Sometimes that might be on enormous, entire worldview altering things like me, who changed my mind about religion. Sometimes people made smaller concessions about how a hypothetical monarchy should be structured. So I won't say we were always debating for the highest stakes, but there was always an assumption that debate involved putting your ideas on the line and putting them at risk. Now, hopefully you guys here tonight are willing to do that, and folks on the live stream are, but your interlocutor may not. So here's kind of my strategy for inviting someone into a debate in which you're willing to really be vulnerable and be docile to the truth. And it starts with giving up any trick or tool of rhetoric that works no matter whether the ideas you're using to support it are true. That means something like kind of keeping up the pace of the argument so your opponent can't keep up, and when they run out of breath, you go, "Oh, so you're wrong, yes? It didn't have an answer for me. I think that means you're wrong and I win. All set?" It means even expecting you can resolve things in a single encounter, a single argument. It's much easier to be kind of bullied into thinking something wrong in a single argument, but the truth is true enough to stand, to put it out there, to cast the seed on whatever ground it may find, and to let the shoots grow. And in my case, there was one definitive argument near the end of my conversion that kind of turned the key, but it had been 4 years of arguments, a lot of books that were added to my bookshelf to get to the point where the soil was prepared for that argument. Defending the truth is a relay race, not a sprint. And it's only people who don't believe that the truth will keep asserting itself that need to close off an argument in one go. Because if you don't get the concession now, you can't trust that the world is going to force the person to it. Now, I have trouble sticking to these principles in the heat of the argument because I am still competitive, and I do kind of get drawn towards that will not to be docile to the truth, but to dominate, to just be smarter than my opponent, more persuasive than my opponent, until finally they concede that I, and by I mean my ideas, are better than theirs. So the main thing that I found to be helpful in shifting my mindset so that I really can be open to the truth, the thing I'm allegedly trying to hand on to my opponent, is kind of stirring up two different emotions besides the will to dominate: curiosity and compassion. And for me, that movement towards curiosity is kind of a place I hopefully can get to even if I start angry. I try and approach an argument, by planning ahead and approaching it, praying for my interlocutor ahead of time. But sometimes I realize I'm in the middle of an argument while it's already happening and I'm already angry. And there, I'm struggling. I do try and pray in that moment, but it's really hard for me to get all the way from, how can you be so wrong, to, this person is a beloved child of God seeking the truth. And so I don't do it in one jump. I just try and go from, how can you be so wrong, to, how can you be so wrong? How are you doing it? I respect you in other parts of your life, and yet you're so wrong about this. It's infuriating, but also confusing. And for me, the biggest gift that gives me is that when I'm angry, all I want from my opponent is the concession. I want them to give up what they have. And I almost don't care about them. I just want that moment of, I'm sorry, Leah, you were right and I was wrong. I'm very embarrassed. But once I'm curious, that concession isn't enough. That sense of driving to annihilate them, which is not only sinful, is now no longer even the illusion of satisfying. Because I want to know something particular about this person. What are you thinking? How can you be so wrong? And I can't get it by bullying them. I have to leave space in the conversation to hear them unpack their ideas, so that I understand what's led them to this point and to this view, and to see where we diverge several steps further back to wind up with me, now a Catholic, and them still an atheist to date. And once I get there, it's no longer enough to shout over them, to just throw reading material at them. I have to want to know them. And if I can, I want to go one step further. Sometimes in the moment, I'm just like, Lord, if you just get me to curiosity, that would be enough. But if I can push a little further, I want to move from, how can you be so wrong, to, what are you in love with? Because St. Thomas Aquinas echoes Aristotle in saying no one does evil but for the sake of a perceived good. And whatever idea my interlocutor is defending, whatever has brought them to their particular philosophy, they're doing it because they're trying to be a good person and trying to be a truthful person. And so in order to be able to argue with them, to get that sense of how can you be so wrong, I have to look at what perceived good they're serving. And it might be a dumb perceived good. I think a number of my friends felt that way about me, once they got past, oh, so you're an atheist. And I'm like, well, yes, I am an atheist, but obviously that doesn't tell you how to live your life. What I am is a Stoic deontologist. And I was about this height, I suppose, but younger looking. And it was a very strong claim to make. And then I tried to make everyone else Stoic deontologists too. And so, no one who's trying to answer the question of my atheism would ever get to the meat of the matter by just going, why don't you believe in God? Because it wasn't my disbelief in God that was organizing my whole life. It was my desire to know truth and do good. And my ways of going about it were classical, but a little bonkers sometimes. So it was kind of by coaxing out that desire I had for truth, for goodness, and ultimately also for beauty, that my friends were able to make the argument against my atheism, not just by attacking the philosophical supports for atheism, not just by attacking Stoic deontology, because that only got me as far as virtue ethics, though that helped, but by really saying, you've got the right idea here, Leah. You should want to know the truth. You do want to do good. We just disagree about how you should be doing it. And when you can get to that point with someone, that point of agreement, the view of them really loving what you love, loving a perceived good that maybe is a true good, but they're serving it in a way that isn't ideal. Loving something that is only a perceived good, and the more you look at their fire of their love for it, the more you realize you want that love directed towards a true good. You could never want that moment of, I'm so sorry, Leah, I was wrong and you were right. I promise not to have any more feelings about anything unless you give me permission. Because I would have quashed that love. At worst, my opponents are like Don Quixote, nobly sallying forth to claim a washing basin as a helmet. And when I see the ardor of their love, I can't wish to strike their helmets, their philosophy simply out of their hands and leave them empty. I say, you are a beautiful lover, and you have chosen a very strange object for your love. But all I wish to do is kindle it and redirect it. And that's kind of always the opportunity we have when we find ourselves in the middle of an argument. It's not just a matter of defending the truth by itself. God is truth. God is sufficient. God doesn't need our defense. What the person we're arguing with needs is a chance to know the truth and to love the truth and to get a sense of what that entails. So when I'm doing this, I'm trying to help my opponent do what I'm doing, to have that sense of curiosity and compassion. But aside from sometimes making them go to my talks or having you guys convey these messages outside the fight, so that by the time you're fighting, they're already interested in how could you be so wrong. The other thing I find that really helps just is making arguments comfortable and making them part of my friendship. In our college debating group, we did debate once a week, Thursday night, from about 7:45 to, I usually left by 1 or 2 a.m., so I can't say for sure how late we went. Debates were always part of a continuing conversation, sometimes till dawn, though usually not for me. But all debates are part of a continuing conversation. And so when you're in the middle of an argument with a friend, make it clear that it's safe for them to not resolve this today and to still be your friend, but that you're interested in continuing to talk about it. And if they come back and go, you know what, I thought of like 3 things I should have said to you, and I went and did some more reading, and now I have other things, you go, excellent, I anticipate we're going to argue about this for quite some time, so I'm glad we're both really investing in this relationship. Give your friend, kind of the comfort of knowing that when they show weakness or uncertainty, you won't take that as cowardice. So often someone might be on the cusp of admitting something that really has given them pause about their own ideas or their own philosophy, or something that truly attracts them about yours. But in every other argument to this point, the ones they've had, the ones they've seen on TV, the moment someone says, yeah, I do struggle with how to resolve that, is the moment the other person goes, so you're wrong and you're stupid. And if you want someone to know that it's safe to explore their doubts with you, you again have to be the one to model that by being willing to say, especially when someone asks you hard questions, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I'm going to have to go look that up, or, talk to the Dominican friars I know who seem to know everything, or do some more reading, or ask someone in the Word on Fire Institute forums. But I don't know that right now. Or even the harder thing, I think, than simple ignorance is, yeah, that bothers me, and I haven't figured out completely how to resolve it. That troubles me, and it's not enough to shift the balance of my faith, but you're right, that bothers me too. And it's kind of by giving that demonstration that we open the door for our interlocutors to share what are kind of the most private parts of their heart, what they truly love and they're trying to defend, and the fears they have that they might be doing the wrong thing. Because ultimately, whenever we find ourselves drawn into argument, the way I like to think of what our project is really drawn from a quote by Rebecca West in her book, Black Lamb, Gray Falcon, where she says, she contrasts kind of the argument culture of the West that she's used to, the argument culture of the Slavs, since she's traveling in Yugoslavia between the world wars. And she says, with her penchant for broad generalization about culture, in the West, conversation is thought to be an acceptable way of sharing information or passing the time. But among Slavs, it is thought to be a waste if the people do not pool their information to travel further towards the redemption of the world. And that's ultimately what I think every argument is. An argument is a chance to move towards the redemption of the world, towards making all things one in Christ. Whether it's an argument that obviously hinges on who he is, when we speak to someone else about their disbelief and we try and get them to be interested in wondering whether Christ is in fact the way, the truth, and the life. Or even in the very small petty arguments where if you decided them by a coin flip, it would not matter, of who will bring the pie to Thanksgiving this year. Each of those is an invitation to renounce division and ask to be part of Christ's work of redemption of the world. Because ultimately, we want to be wholly docile to the truth, wholly submerged in it, and we want to be with God. And we want every single person we know and love, or don't love yet, but are at the anger stage, so we're hoping to move towards love through curiosity, to be there with us. And that means being wholly united before the beatific vision. And every argument closed eventually, and closed in love.
Lent, namely a penitential period, a time when people come to grips with their limitations, their sins, their attachments, to prepare for real communion with God.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host, and I'm joined here in our new setup for the Word on Fire show by Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey Brandon, good to see you. Good to hear from you.
We talked about this in the last episode, but we've revamped the setups, not only of your YouTube commentaries, but also this Word on Fire show. We're still in the same studio space, which is a really, really small room there at the Mission in Santa Barbara, but we've been able to turn it into multiple sets now, and we're all just so enthusiastic about the way it looks now. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks to our donors. It's wonderful, and we got to just keep going and doing the Lord's work, and it's expensive, as I say, and so we're grateful to those who've helped us with this.
Bishop, you recently visited the Carmelite Sisters of Alhambra out there in your region. Tell us what that visit was like.
They're a marvelous community, about 140 sisters, I think. They were founded way back in Mexico, actually, during the Cristero period, and their foundress, the wonderful Madre Luisita, came up here to the States to flee the persecution back in the 20s, and then established the community in L.A. And I was at one of the sites now of their order. They take care of the poor and the sick and the aged, and they're just a marvelous, uplifting, life-giving community to be with. So there was a joy. I celebrated the Mass for the birthday of the foundress. And then there was a wonderful show they put on for me afterwards in the Carmelite tradition. That goes back to the Little Flower. Remember, she talks about they would put on these plays and so on. Well, they still do that. And they were kind of teasing me by making Madre Luisita one of the pivotal players. And so they used some of the film from our work. So they were just a delight.
We'll have to film episode 13 of Pivotal Players to feature her in there, huh?
Yeah.
Now, we're recording this just a couple of days before Lent begins. Ash Wednesday is on February 26th this year. And so I thought we'd spend this whole episode discussing Lent, what it means, how we do it, what it's looked like throughout the ages. So first of all, I guess a basic question, what's the purpose of Lent, these 40 days before Easter? Why does the church give that to us? What's it supposed to be about?
To prepare us for Easter. Brandon, it goes way back. In really all the great religious traditions, you find something like Lent, namely a penitential period, a time when people come to grips with their limitations, their sins, their attachments, to prepare for real communion with God. And that's the purpose of Lent, is to get us ready for Easter. Part of it is we can just become blasé, I suppose, about an event like the resurrection of Jesus. We've known about it, we've heard about it, we celebrate it every year, but are we ready for it? That's what Lent is. So it corresponds, of course, to Jesus' own 40 days in the desert, preparing for his public ministry. I think for all of us, it's just indispensable that on a regular basis, we go into the desert. A lot of important things happen in the desert, and that's the purpose of Lent.
I know for a lot of Catholics, maybe the majority of Catholics in the pew, when we hear Lent, we just think, okay, giving up chocolate. Like that's what basically Lent means, And there's nothing, I don't want to bemoan that and say that that's bad. It's good to give up something that you're maybe attached to, but is Lent more than that? What more is Lent than just giving up sweets for 40 days?
Yeah, and that can be one expression of it. Classically, Lent involves three practices: prayer, fasting, and that's where even something like that comes in, and thirdly, almsgiving. So those are the three classical practices. Something, Brandon, I'd like to emphasize is Lent is not so much in here. It's a set of things that we do. Pray during Lent, fast during Lent, give alms during Lent. Three activities, three things that we do. That, I think, helps to orient us to this holy season.
Let's talk about each of those three pillars. Maybe we'll spend a good amount of time on each one. So first of all, prayer. I think this is the one most obviously people associate with Lent. It tends to be a time when the church in the liturgy and through devotions deepens its intensity of prayer. How do we do this? What do you recommend to Catholics to deepen their prayer during Lent?
First of all, prayer is the raising of the mind and the heart to God, the famous definition from John Damascene. I love that, to raise the mind and the heart to God. It means to attend to God, to be aware of God, to seek communion with God in a conscious way. Raising up of the mind, yes, with all of our consciousness and attentiveness, our perception, our intellectual ability, but also to raise up the heart to God. So our passions and our feelings and our emotions and the longings of our soul, to do that in a very explicit, conscious way is to pray. So I think, this morning I begin every day with a holy hour. And I go into my chapel and I genuflect before the Blessed Sacrament, and then I just enter into this hour of prayer. It involves the office and other things, and the rosary and so on. But the basic move is I'm consciously raising my mind and heart to God. It's so easy for us just to lose track of that. So that's what the essence of prayer is. Now, how do you do it? All kinds of practices we could recommend. What's the greatest prayer? The Mass. I'd say to Catholics maybe who've drifted away, if you stop going to Mass on Sunday, Lent is a great time now to say, I am going to go back to Sunday Mass. Do you go to Mass on Sunday? Okay. How about daily Mass during Lent? Or even I'm going to go, twice during the week during Lent. That whatever you're doing in regard to the Mass, raise it a level, intensify it. Maybe enter more deeply into the Mass. Get a study guide or a book or a video or something on the Mass so you can more deeply appreciate it. I mentioned the Rosary. It's a very important prayer. If you've been away from the Rosary for a long time, well, find it. It's probably in a drawer somewhere in your house, or it's gathering dust somewhere. Find it. Use it. Pray it. If it's difficult for you, maybe try once a week. Each week during Lent, you're going to pray the Rosary. Try it twice a week. I'd recommend pray it every day if you can. The Jesus prayer is one that I've always recommended. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's the whole Jesus prayer. But you can pray it over and again for a minute, for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for an hour. Let it become part of the rhythm of your breathing. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Try that prayer during Lent. Devotions, the Stations of the Cross, to go to your local church and to do that prayerful meditation on the death of Jesus. Enter into these devotions maybe you haven't practiced since you were a kid. And you say, oh, it's been so long. Well, okay, Lent's a good time to enter into those again. So those are all ways, Brandon, that we can pray. I mentioned the Holy Hour. Now maybe that's relatively advanced, I guess, but Fulton Sheen, one of our great heroes, recommended it to every priest when he gave a retreat, to lay people when he gave them a retreat. His practical advice was every day, spend an hour before the Blessed Sacrament. Maybe you're getting started, it's a holy 15 minutes, it's a holy half hour. Okay, start with the head if you want. But spend time in adoration. May I say, I might have mentioned this now in an earlier show, Brandon, that when I met with the Pope for the Ad Limina visit, when the bishops of my region met with him, one of the first things he said to us was, teach your people adoration. Teach your people adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. And that stayed in my mind. So another prayerful practice you could exercise during Lent. All those are ways.
Is there an especially Lenten character of prayer that maybe is distinct from other liturgical seasons? I'm thinking like of the season of Advent, which takes the form of expectation and longing. How long, O Lord, how long? Or, O come, O Israel. How about Lent? Is there a specific character of Lenten prayer?
Well, it's probably penitential in form, getting in touch with my own weakness, asking the Lord for forgiveness, asking for help in your struggle against, your own vices and your own attachments, your own sin. Brandon, it's not a morbid thing at all. Getting in touch with your sinfulness is a great form of prayer. If I, before the Lord, confess, there's the formal sacrament of reconciliation, but just the confession of sin in the presence of the Lord, that's a good prayerful practice. And it shouldn't depress you. It's in front of the Lord who loves you more than you love yourself, and to say, help me deal with, Lord, this issue. In Ignatius of Loyola, you've got the consciousness examen at the end of the day. It's when you kind of review your day in light of God. All the great things happen to you, the opportunities, the graces, but also all the things that blocked you. Today I had the opportunity, Lord, to do this work of charity, but I didn't do it. Today, Lord, I allowed that person just to bug me, and I didn't reach out in forgiveness and love. I had this chance which I, missed. Good. Don't feel, that you're falling into the slough of despond. I mean, you're confessing in the presence of the Lord. Those are all forms of Lenten prayer, it seems to me.
So that's the first major pillar of Lent, prayer. Let's look at the second pillar, which is fasting. Now, Bishop, fasting has become all the rage in the world in general, in our general culture. You talk about intermittent fasting, people fasting for various health benefits, bodybuilding benefits, but from a religious perspective, from a spiritual perspective, why do we fast? What are the spiritual benefits of fasting?
Well, attachment detachment, right, is a great spiritual category. We tend to get attached to created things, and we make them godlike in our lives. They take on an exaggerated importance. When that happens, it's good sometimes to actively detach oneself from them so as to find what the soul really wants. See, the soul can be so caught up in secondary goods that it even begins to forget what it really wants. So if you're so sated all the time by seeking out sensual pleasure, you can forget, that your soul wants something much more than that. We're longing ultimately for God. Only in God is the soul at rest. So we all know that. Every sinner knows it, but I think our culture especially, that kind of awful, sickly feeling when you're sated by a lot of sensual pleasures, food or drink or sex, as Aquinas put it, but your soul is left arid. Your soul is left unsatisfied. Well, one of the practices is to fast, purposely to set aside some of these sensual pleasures, so as to allow the deeper hungers to emerge. Please, it has nothing to do with Puritanism or Platonism or dualism. It doesn't mean that we hate pleasure. That's a caricature. I mean, maybe some Christian expressions have fallen into that. But that's a caricature. Christians love the world because God made it good. We love food and drink and sensual pleasure. But they can become so dominant that we forget the deepest longing of the heart. And so we fast so as to allow that hunger to emerge. Something I've always loved from Thomas Merton, where he said, the sensual desires can be like little kids. I want it. A little kid that wants something right now. And even though look, that's not good for you. We're going to eat in an hour and you don't need an ice cream cone right now. But I want it. And if we allow our sensual desires to dominate us, it's like that. We start doing things that aren't good for us. So fasting is a wonderful way to rediscover the deepest longing of the heart. It's not a Platonism or a Puritanism. It's a spiritual cleansing, if you want, to allow the deepest hunger to express itself.
Bishop, the minimum that the Church asks of Catholics during Lent in terms of fasting is to abstain from meat on all Fridays, and then on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday to fast. And at least in America, the way fasting is defined is one small meal with maybe a couple of snacks. You've worked with a lot of people in spiritual direction elsewhere. Is that minimum usually what you recommend to most people? Do you recommend they fast more than that? And how do you make that determination?
Yeah, I've always said to people, look, at the very least, do what the Church asks. It's not that demanding. And I'll say this too, Brandon. Many years now of living through Lent, very often it's precisely the Friday abstinence that stays most in my mind or kind of bugs me the most, or you know what I mean? That I'm most aware that it's Lent. Because, and I think you and I have this in common, I don't like fish. And so for me, it's a real, I don't want to exaggerate, like it's a terrible suffering, but it does get my attention, let's put it that way, Friday and Lent, because I can't have meat and I can't have fish. And so it's like, oh, what am I going to do? Well, that's all good. See, that's good because it brings it into my body, the fact of Lent. It brings it into my practical planning that I'm aware of Lent. So at the very least, yeah, follow what the Church recommends. There's some people, I know there are fish lovers that, oh, I love fish, so they have an extra helping, on Friday. It's kind of defeating the purpose, I've often encouraged people, is there a form of sensual pleasure that's too dominant in your life? Name that, and then try to get some control over it. So the church's recommendations about fasting, but maybe that you could push it a little bit further. Maybe it is skipping a meal, once a week. I know some people who do really, really serious fasting, like bread and water fasting on a Friday during Lent. Okay, as you say, we're doing it now for bodybuilding purposes and health purposes, so, why not for spiritual purpose too? There's something mysterious too, Brandon, isn't there? It goes right back to the Bible itself, and it comes up through the tradition, that something about fasting accomplishes certain spiritual ends. And I can't explain that exactly. But Jesus' famous line about, this type of demon only comes out through prayer and fasting. And I've talked to a number of really spiritually alert people that I've known, and they'll say that. They'll say, oh yeah, fasting. If you want to accomplish that, you've got to fast. Now, why that works, I don't entirely know. But there's a lot of spiritual power to it. Now, as you say, how about something like, for a lot of us today, I'll include myself, addiction to video, not video games, but like the video, the iPhone and the video stuff and screens. How about a little fasting from screens? Now, I realize the irony, I'm saying this as I'm appearing on a screen, but you know what I mean, is we can get too caught up in that business. Fast a little bit, cut back on purpose, limit your time. Find something in your life that you think, I am giving this too much attention, and fast from it.
All right, so we've looked at the first two pillars of Lent, prayer and fasting. Let's turn to the third and final one, which is almsgiving. What's the connection between almsgiving and the spiritual life? I think for a lot of people, the connection is obvious when it comes to prayer and fasting. Those seem to bear obvious spiritual fruit. But how does almsgiving help our souls?
Oh gosh, in so many ways, huh? Because if the heart of the spiritual life is caritas, right? It's love, to will the good of the other. That's a very concrete way to will the good of the other. There are poor people around us all the time. Find a way during Lent to give to them, to give of yourself. And I like the fact that it has to do with money. It makes it really concrete, because we can get very sort of gassy and abstract about that. I'm giving of myself. Okay, but when it comes to money, I'm going to give alms. I'm going to give some material value to the poor. That cuts very close to the bone, doesn't it? It brings it home in a very vivid way. So I think it not just encourages, it is charity. It is the very heart of the spiritual life. See, prayer is meant to give rise to charity, ultimately. Fasting is meant to give rise to charity because it links me more deeply to God, who is caritas, who is love. So almsgiving, in some ways, that's what it's all about. It also, I think, really heightens our sense of solidarity within the mystical body, that we're connected to each other. We cannot say someone who's suffering, that's their problem. I'm not going to worry about it. It's not my problem. No, it's our problem. It's our problem. Certainly all we who are baptized, but Aquinas speaks even of, the virtual mystical body, that everyone in principle is meant to be part of the mystical body. And so anyone, anywhere who's suffering is brother and sister to me. And almsgiving signals that, in a very vivid way. I think, I live out here in California where the homeless problem is very acute, and it's becoming more acute all over the place. Are there poor people literally at our doorsteps now? Yeah, very often. Lent's a beautiful time, to do something to reach out to them.
Yeah, maybe offer a few more examples. I think when it comes to almsgiving, a lot of people just have in mind maybe dropping an extra envelope in the collection plate when it passes on Sunday, maybe writing a check to a charity, but what are some ways we can give alms beyond just that?
And those aren't bad. So even those things you mentioned kind of off the top of your head, those are good. But think of so many ways. Let's say you typically tip 15% at a restaurant, or 20%. How about in Lent up at 5%? It's as a form of almsgiving. Tip your waiter or waitress a little more than you usually do. How about during Lent? I realize this might get you on every mailing list in America, but you just make a resolution that any time during Lent some solicitation for money comes from a charity, give something. You're not going to ask any questions. You're just going to say, okay, I abandon myself to God's providence, and God will send me places that need my help. Give something. Put a poor box in your house for Lent, especially like you've got all your kids, Brandon, people with big families. Whenever anyone leaves the house, they have to put something in the poor box. And it could be a little bit, it could be a dime, it could be $1, whatever. But how about for those 40 days, every time you leave the house, you're going to put something in the poor box to remind you of those in the world who are in great need. One that I've recommended over the years, and I challenge myself because I'm not very good at following this, but when you're buying something during Lent, whether you're buying a car, you're buying a suit of clothes, you're buying a TV set, or you're buying groceries, find the item that you really want and could afford, but on purpose buy the next level down, the one that's less expensive, and give the difference to the poor. So let's say we'll give a grand example. I'm buying a car, and here's the car I want, and I could afford it. All right, on purpose, get the next one down, but give the difference to the poor. There's that TV set that I really want. I want that giant TV set, and I could afford that. Buy a smaller one. Give the difference to the poor. All kinds of ways. And be creative, One thing I recommend, too, during Lent, make sure you've got loose dollar bills and all that in your pocket so that when someone you see on the street is asking for money, maybe, especially during Lent, you say, I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm not going to have any hesitation. I'm just going to give something. Just get an almsgiving mentality in mind all during those 40 days.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. We love hearing from our listeners, and we'd love to hear your question. Just send it in by visiting askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question on any device. Today we have one from Sarah, who lives in Central Texas, and she's got a burning question about God's nature. Here's her question.
My name is Sarah, and I'm from Central Texas. My question is, how do I respond to someone if they made the statement, if God made us in God's image, and God prefers a family to be husband, wife, and children, then it must mean that there is God represented as mother.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a complex, really set of questions you're raising. Can God be represented as mother? Sure, in a way. The Bible uses maternal metaphors a lot for God. God, in himself, of course, is beyond gender specification. God's a spirit, so we wouldn't talk about God being gendered the way we are. And so can we use metaphors drawn from the feminine world? Of course, and the Bible does it all the time. So God loves us the way, could a mother forget her child? Even if she forget, I will never forget you. I've carved you in the palm of my hand, etc. So sure, we can represent God that way. What I wouldn't do is kind of overdraw the connection or overstate the metaphor. There is something like family, that God is like a family, because we talk about Father, Son, and Spirit. There is real differentiation among the persons, but I wouldn't overdraw it. If now we have to say, well, God's like father, mother, child. If I can be a little bold, follow Balthazar here, in a way the differences among the persons are greater than any differences in the created order. You know what I'm saying? That they're the ground for all differentiation. So are men and women different? Of course. And are the Father and Son and Spirit different? Yeah, even more dramatically. But I wouldn't press the metaphors that we have to see within God, mother, father, mother, and child. Feminine metaphors, sure, but I'd stick with Father, Son, and Spirit.
Well, thanks for that question, Sarah, and thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Again, if you haven't seen the new setup for the Word on Fire show, be sure to go to wordonfireshow.com, click on this episode, view the video version, or you can find it on YouTube and Facebook. Also, I've mentioned this over the last few episodes. I'll mention it one more time, that as we're beginning Lent, I want to encourage you to encourage your parish to sign up for the Word on Fire Engage platform. We're offering it for free during Lent. You can find it at wordonfireshow.com/engage. When your parish signs up, you get all sorts of cool tools and resources to evangelize your parish, including full access to all of Bishop Barron's films and study programs for every parishioner. That means every person in your parish can watch the Catholicism series, the Pivotal Players series, all of Bishop Barron's study programs. So if that sounds appealing, go to wordonfireshow.com/engage. Well, thanks so much.